The last homely house east of the sea is how Rivendell is called. The House of Elrond is located between the fallen kingdom of Arnor and the towering Misty Mountains. No stranger to conflict against the tide of evil, the Elves of Imladris have fought against the Witch Realm of Angmar and marched into Mordor alongside men. Having fought against orcs all across Middle-earth, the Elves of Imladris have earned a reputation for fighters of incredible skill in all aspects of battle, slaying orcs by the dozen with ease alongside their human allies. Their prowess may be great, however, their numbers are certainly not. When looking at the strengths of Imladris, it's easy to group all of the elves together in a way, and with regards to the first strength that I'm going to be mentioning, it certainly does apply universally to all the elves because they place a great emphasis on their melee skill and their ranged accuracy, the finer points of warfare as it were. Both of these things, the elves don't really, they're certainly not a volume focused faction, let's put it that way, and they prefer to beat their opponents by being better than them in every aspect of fighting as opposed to having great numbers. The skill carrying the obvious benefit that it more than makes up for the fact that you're going to be outnumbered almost all the time when you play as the elves, as you will be greatly superior to the vast majority of infantry you come across. It's going to take a tier of units higher than your own to comfortably beat the units you have. For example, the basic elven infantry, it will take a higher tier human unit to be able to beat them one-to-one, which means in terms of cost efficiency, the elves honestly can make that happen pretty easily in terms of a melee fight. It takes more initiative on behalf of your opponent to try and get the best out of their army rather than your own, because the vast majority of fights that you can that you will be engaging in with regards to a similar price range are going to be yours unless the opponent has a superior position. And the accuracy, even though the elves generally speaking don't have the most hardy units, although with Imladris that is a little bit false as we will get onto in a moment, they can still engage in skirmish fights purely because their accuracy is so much better. If you decide to go archer heavy, which might be a bit predictable as the elves, you can still do an awful lot of damage, however, and if you go for the kiting strategies, the elves can certainly make that work. However, the elves are all distinct, and with regards to how Imladris work, the thing that I would certainly note with regards to their units throughout is their high and ultra tier units are what really sets them apart from the other elves. All three of the other elven factions will have some sort of gap in their line. Imladris do not have that, however. They have uber tier units available for both infantry, heavy infantry, spears, heavy cavalry, archers. Every aspect of their army you can really focus in on and have a really high tier unit there to really tie things together, and this is something that the other elves lack in a way. I mean, obviously you have Mirkwood, which are going to have the skirmishers, but they perhaps lack a little bit in terms of their infantry. And then you have Linden, who have maybe a little bit of a lack in terms of their foot archers, whereas Imladris make that up with some really high tier stuff. And it is worth mentioning that it is mainly at the high tier where this is going to come into play for Imladris, and this does carry some negative consequences as well, which we will get onto in a moment. But it's hard not to say that it's a very big advantage for Imladris to have all of these options at their disposal in which they could potentially outplay their opponents. And the final advantage to playing Imladris, which I care to mention, is actually pretty significant because, for the most part, the elven factions lack armour next to all other factions, but Imladris do have pretty decent armour values. Now, I do hasten to add that this is in comparison to their elven brethren. If you compare them to the dwarves, of course, they're still going to be a little bit lagging behind in some of the more heavily armoured focused kingdoms of men. But even so, the fact that the Elves of Imladris do have this armour helps them greatly at dealing with arrow fire, which some of the other elven factions can struggle with if they're outnumbered in terms of the skirmish line. Imladris, however, with their good armour, will be a lot more resilient to that sort of thing. It does, of course, carry the connotation that they could potentially be a little bit weaker to armour-piercing weaponry, but for the most part, armour-piercing units are pretty low on skill, and so the Imladris infantry line will easily be able to outskill them and be able to emerge victorious regardless. But yeah, having good armour for elves is certainly something that I would say is one of Imladris' most identifying features. You can certainly say that by the way that they dress, that Imladris style, of course. It's not just for show, it has some practical benefits as well. As far as things go for the elves in general, and of course Imladris, there are some rather obvious weaknesses to how they play, and the first one is that they are very expensive. Perhaps Imladris more so than their elven brethren, purely because the price for having pretty much a very high tier option with regards to anything you do means you will have to leave one of those options behind, at least one. you can't bring your high tier cavalry, archers and infantry without horribly exposing yourself in terms of the amount of units in total that you've brought. So really the expense of elves is demonstrated most fully by Imladris, so you will have to make a choice depending on who you're fighting, whether you want to maybe cut down on your archers a bit, cut down on your cavalry a bit, or your infantry. One of those three aspects is going to be a little bit lesser because of the overall expense of your army. Your men are worth every florin that you spend on them as the elves, but you do need to be careful that you've got the right composition, otherwise your opponent will find weaknesses with your army. And that brings us neatly onto another universal weakness of the elves, their small unit sizes. Generally speaking, you're going to be outnumbered in pretty much every matchup you come across, unless you're against another elf, of course. But yeah, I mean, obviously, if you have a look here, you can see that 123 men in the unit is the highest amount I've got on the field. And that's pretty much a universal fact of life as the elves. You're going to be outnumbered, so you're going to have to try and stretch and spread your opponent a little bit so that you're not facing the full onslaught of a completely overwhelming force. If you can do that, however, 1-to-1 they will match up very well. But trying to nuke box up as the elves won't really serve you too well because it just invites you to be overwhelmed. And it is a trap that I feel like many people might fall into unless they are aware of the fact that despite the fact that they are far superior individually to the vast majority of troops you're going to be coming up against, you need to be a little bit more proactive because your lower numbers will allow the enemy to wash over you if you stay a little bit more static. You do need to be a little bit more, you need to be a little more proactive in the fight, and you know the small unit sizes are perhaps a bigger weakness that many people think of when they think of the elves, because for the most part I think people think their units are worth it, and they are right, but the small unit sizes is really a weakness you can't get away from. It's not a good thing no matter how you spin it. There is one kind of unit that Imladris lack as well, and that is they have no hand projectile units. They don't have any axe throwers nor javelins, and this is again in contrast to all three of the other elven factions. And it's a pretty big weakness. I mean, in the current patch, the hand projectiles are really very venomous. They can do a lot of damage, and in particular you can use them to zone out cavalry that gets too close. You can use it to really equalise the infantry fight, and it's something that Imladris lack entirely, and it's also something that can be leveraged against them if they haven't invested in their skirmish line, which is possible as Imladris. You might want to maybe spend money on just your cheaper skirmishes and go more infantry and cavalry focused. That's definitely a very viable way of doing things. So hand projectiles, you know, I feel as though there is a reason why Imladris don't have them, and that is because their infantry line is so potentially powerful. The extra armour they have is a very genuine benefit to them in sustained melee, so having those hand projectiles would probably be a little bit overkill. But even so, the lack of hand projectiles could potentially hurt them. It's something that can be used to equalise a fight very, very quickly, and if things are going against you as the elves, it can be very quickly to stop that from cascading out of control. Hand projectiles are one of those things that can do that, and it's something that Imladris lacks, so you need to be very sure of yourself going into a battle when you set up. You need to choose a plan and stick to it, otherwise if you try and be too reactive to your opponent, you could end up in that sort of situation, and hand projectiles, I feel like they give you a bit more margin for error with regards to doing that, but obviously Imladris don't have access to any of them. So yeah, that's a little quick overview of the advantages, some of the advantages and disadvantages anyway, of what I think Imladris are all about. So now let's go and have a look at their roster on the grassy plain. And we start off with the bread and butter of the High Elves as they have always been, or the Elves of Imladris as they are now called, the Eldar Makar, previously known as the Sword Quindi. Now, having a look at some of the stats of this, it basically epitomises the elves. When you compare it to a sort of basic human unit, the majority of a basic sword and board unit from a human faction, their defence would come from their armour and their shield value. With the Quindi, however, it's a lot different. Most of it comes from their skill. With a defence skill of 10, they are going to be in excess of anything that the humans, the dwarves and the orcs can provide at a similar cost, which of course means that provided they aren't overwhelmed 1-to-1, they're going to do very nicely against units of a similar type to themselves from other factions that are non-elf, of course. Having a look, they also have another unit model over here. This is a really nice looking unit model, I must say, as well. The upgraded variant of the Eldar Makar, so you can upgrade the armour of them as well. The armour value of them is only 3, of course, which is their weakness. If you can get archers into the elven backline and start shooting into the backs of a unit like this, they will fall away very, very quickly. And of course, another worthwhile weakness, as we mentioned before, is the low unit sizes. You know, a Kingdom of Men unit will have around 160-ish, sort of that sort of level of men in the unit. The Dwarves can also expect something similar, whereas the Eldar Makar, of course, only 123 in a unit normally. So they can be pretty easily overwhelmed. But again, provided you can stretch the enemy army a lot more, then you will be facing down a lot. You know, reducing the density of the enemy front line, I think, is going to be key when playing as the Elves, and this is a unit which epitomises that, because if you can, again, if you're only facing one unit head-on, the Eldar Makar can do very well in most cases, but if you're facing a densely packed formation of enemies with pikes and swords, that's where the Eldar Makar can potentially struggle, because of course, I often speak about the cliff that units tend to fall off when they lose a certain amount of unit models. That's closer for the Eldar Makar, simply because they start off at a relatively low amount of men. But again, Elves tend to have excellent morale, so they're going to be sticking in the fight for that much longer. You can't really break them too easily. Of course, the Elves are very brave in the face of danger. And the Eldar Makar, looking at the other sort of elven kingdoms with their basic units, the Eldar Makar are probably the strongest of this type of unit, simply because it's what Imladris are all about. You know, they are slightly more infantry focused than their elven cousins, a little bit more prone to just getting stuck in and fighting in the pits, as it were. So that is the first of the elven units, and I do like them. You can have 6 before the cost increases as well, so I'd say you're going to be seeing these guys again when you face Imladris quite a lot. You can almost bet on the fact there's going to be at least a single unit of them in the army, simply because they are, you know, the only unit that you could classify as affordable for the Elves of Imladris, and even then it's 625. The Elves don't have such thing as militia, so yeah. We shall move on to bigger and better things, even though this is a very solid base for Imladris. Now we move on to the Eldar Etar. I think that's how you pronounce that. Again, the elven names are going to cause me no end of trouble all throughout these overviews, so I do apologise if I get the names wrong. But previously called the Linden Longspears, I've always been quite critical of this unit in the past, because it's never seemed to be that good. It's always been the real... It's always been the black sheep of the High Elves, as it were. However, I can see that the benefit to bringing them now, because they will add a bit of rigidity to your front line. They can form spear wall, of course, as they've always been able to. They can fight cavalry. I would classify them as a pike unit, technically speaking, because they aren't effective against armour like halberdiers are. Again, they are light pikes, though. They are, you know, that sort of... It is going to be a little bit risky to bring them in certain situations, because the Elves, I think most people will want to bring some lower tier skirmishes to try and get good value off them against the Elves, potentially, with some of the lower armoured units. And even Imladris, despite the fact a lot of their armoured units are very good, their lower tier, you know, it's really up the higher tier, the higher end of the spectrum that the Imladris units tend to get that nice armour value. Whereas here at the sort of the more basic units that they're going to be made up of, they still suffer the same weakness as the other Elves with regards to some low armour values. Having a look at the unit as a whole as well, it is I think the cheapest in the Elven roster, actually, at 600. You can have 4 before the cost increases, so you can potentially shore up your front line pretty well with these polearms. Archers are obviously going to be their primary weakness. Their defensive skill of 3, their armour of 3. Again, it's a very pikes, you know, the pikes stats are a little bit off simply because it's how pikes work. But the attack value of 9 is pretty decent, honestly. I mean, obviously they're going to be weak to mass. That's going to be the primary thing, alongside the archers, that you're going to have to watch out for, because enemies pushing their way through the lines is going to be a problem with these guys around. There are better polearm units that the Elves of Imladris have available to them, and I would be tempted to go for them over the Eldar Etar. I mean, I can see them potentially being used to cover the back lines more so than being on the front line, in a similar way to the sentries of Khazad-dûm I mentioned in the previous overview. I would suggest that would be potentially what they're pretty good at. If you put them in loose formation, keep them at the back, then they're going to be able to cover your skirmishers much better against the enemy cavalry, as well as your own cavalry, which can be used in conjunction with that. You can make life very difficult for your opponent to get to your skirmishers, and obviously the longer you leave elven skirmishers alone, the more they're going to be able to rain terror down on your army. So yeah, maybe not the most glamorous unit in the Imladris roster, but still offers you a bit of utility, I think. And from here on out, in terms of melee infantry, we're going to be getting into the good stuff, the stuff that everyone wants to see, I'm sure. And we start off with the Imladris Blade Masters, which we had a look briefly at before the patch came out, of course. And this is where the armour jumps up. We had an armour value of 3 on the previous 2 units, which is what you can expect from most of the other sort of basic elven units. But the Imladris Blade Masters have an armor value of 12, which is very high. It's comparable to some of the Khazad-dûm units, which shows you how different the Elves of Imladris go about their business compared to some of the other Elven factions. Having a look at some of the other stats they have available to them as well, they have an attack of 15, which is pretty damn high, particularly when you consider that they also have a bonus fighting cavalry, which is unique to this particular Elven two-hander, next to the equivalents from other factions, which is again another potential banana peel for your opponent's cavalry. Obviously, off the charge, enemy cavalry is going to do a lot of damage to this unit, particularly if it's isolated and they get a nice flat charge on them. But even so, if they maybe mistime the charge, if it's a little bit strung out, and they get involved in melee with the Imladris Blade Masters, that can do a terrible amount of damage to enemy cavalry very quickly. At least as long as they're not multiple HP cav, they can probably escape pretty well, especially the higher mass variants. Having a look at some of the other things as well, they obviously have a high amount of defense skill as well, 15. Definitely the sort of thing I can see being used quite a lot for the Elves of Imladris because of the utility, the extra damage against cavalry, and the fact that they're going to be doing a lot of damage against infantry as well, in combination with the cheaper and the more numerous Eldar Makar. You have a front line which is skillful and potentially dealing a lot of damage and very cost effective as well. They only have 104 men in the unit. You can have 2 before the cost increases. 850 is a pretty decent chunk of change, but again, as the Elves, you're going to be spending quite a lot of money on the units that you want to do that damage. As the Elves of Imladris, more so than the others, I would say, you're going to have to pick your strategy with your army selections and then really stick to it. And if you pick the Imladris Blade Masters, you've definitely, I think, gone for a little bit more of a proactive build, because even though they do have armor, they will still lose unit models pretty quickly under sustained arrow fire, so you need to get them in the thick of it. You need to get them fighting, laying out their pretty impressive amounts of damage very quickly. Very nice unit model as well. They don't have an upgrade model, but even so, with an armor value of 12, I'd say they don't really need it. Now we move on to one of the iconic units that's been with us ever since Vanilla Reforged, Vanilla Third Age, I should say. The Eldar Enway Heru Hatal, previously known as the Eldar Enway Spearmen, of course. A few changes have happened since the previous patch. They are now no longer a single-use multiple HP unit. You can have 2 before the cost increases, which is important because the Elves, they need a bit of mass and rigidity to their centre, particularly in a siege, to prevent them just being barged out the way, and this is the unit that will provide that because of the multiple units of them that you can bring. Obviously they can form shield wall, a bonus fighting cavalry in a sustained fight, obviously, you know, the spears. The very long spears trait as well, I was told, is not tied to the pikemen animation, but instead it allows spears to counter-attack when they are attacked. So mechanically it works a little bit different than I had assumed, so it is not actually incorrect that it is here. But it will really help them in a fight against infantry as well, because despite the malice that spears have against infantry, those counter-attacks can be pretty important. And having a look at the stats, obviously they are a very, very impressive spear unit indeed. The attack value of 12 is enormous. That is 3 times the amount of a lot of the basic human spears. Now, to call them a basic spear is obviously doing them a great disservice, but it proves how superior in terms of skill they are. And then obviously if you have a look, an armor value of 13 is also huge, a shield value of 11, defense skill of 12, a total defense of 36 is in excess of any unit in the Dwarves of Khazad-dûm. Most of that admittedly comes from the fact that they are a highly skillful unit, but even so, to note that they have a higher base defense than even the mighty Mithril Guard shows how much skill can come into a total defense value. The Elves are pretty reliant on that though, so it's not overpowered. I am actually curious to see. I don't think there's a difference in the unit model between the two, which is odd, or is there? No, I don't think so. Well, regardless, they can have their armour upgraded as well, so that's interesting to see. Obviously 1050 is a pretty big expense, and I can see them being primarily used in a siege battle situation purely because of that expense. I mean, if you bring 2, that's a total of 2100 florins you've spent on 2 spear units, which will hold the front line of course, but as Imladris you're already stretched thin enough as it is, particularly when you factor in the cost of a potential general's bodyguard unit, and your main line is not cheap either, so if you bring both of them in a field battle you're going to have a very small army indeed. But in a siege, both offensive and defensive, I can see them having a great deal of success at pushing their way through lower tier of units and holding back the horde of orcs that is inevitably going to be descending upon Rivendell in several battles, I'm sure. Now we come to the much more impressive pike unit within Imladris, the Imladris sentries. Of course, in the previous patches they've been pretty infamous for being able to kill things quickly, and as far as pikemen go, they still have that distinction. Having a look at some of their stats, for example, an attack value of 11 on a pike unit is very high. They also have high armour at 12 and a defence skill of 6. Obviously these numbers are lower when you compare them to the other units, but obviously that's just the nature of pike stats. They might not look very impressive, but I can promise you that for a pike unit they very much are. Very similar in terms of, well, they're the same tier of unit to the 1st Legion pikes from Khazad-dûm. They even cost the same, so 1100. You can also have 2 before the cost increases, so 2200 florins is a pretty steep investment for a couple of pikes, but I think with Imladris there is a case for saying you do want to bring both of them, both on an open field and obviously in a siege. In a siege they can potentially be extremely powerful, holding back waves and waves of lower tier troops. It really takes you, the enemy's going to want to either push through them or just try and find another route around them. But even on a field battle, because they can hold together a comparatively smaller line of infantry very, very well. I mean, even though they can be stretched quite thin, because there are 2 of them, you can hold together a much bigger surface area and then allow perhaps a more comprehensive skirmish line or cavalry force to really get in behind the enemy, and they can act as a very nice anvil indeed. Obviously they can inspire nearby troops as well, which is very nice, just like the Blade Masters. Expert at hiding in woods is an interesting one. You could potentially, as long as Imladris is certainly the least ambushy of the elven factions, but if there is a heavily forested map, then you could potentially do it. They have very good stamina and excellent morale, of course. All of the elven units are going to have very high morale. On average, they are the highest morale of all of the factions there are, at least faction types. I've heard people say that maybe the dwarves should be, but the elves, mechanically it makes sense for the elves to be, because obviously they have lower a lower amount of men in the unit, as I get my words out. Only 104 men in the unit, which potentially means they are outnumbered in terms of the pike fight, but Imladris have always been about quality over quantity, and perhaps nowhere else is this more apparent than in a pike unit like this. I'm a big fan of the Imladris sentries. I think that if you use them correctly, they can really act as the glue that holds your front line together. And now we come to essentially the higher tier option if you want a sword and board unit to the Eldar Makar, the Imladris Guardians. Having a look at some of their stats, an attack value of 10, again, is pretty decent. But it is primarily going to be their defence that you're going to be looking at. As with most sword and board units, you're going to be expecting them to hold the front. You want them to last a long time, and the Imladris Guardians, I should say, are going to be no disappointment there. A total defence of 29 is in excess of basically any other faction, any other non-elven faction, if you spent a similar amount of money, would not be able to reach a total defence of 29 a lot of the time. An armour value of 8 is not half bad for the elves, and they have a defence skill of 10 and a shield value of 11. That shield value of 11 is pretty significant as well, makes them resilient to archers. It's going to be in excess of a lot of what equivalent factions can afford as well. Having a look over here as well, we have the upgraded model, which is of course the Imladris Storm Guard. So now they're not just going to be the slightly disappointing alternative to the Mythlon Nobles, because both of them have essentially been combined into one unit, and I've always really liked that upgrade model because it's very Imladris. That style has always been very iconic. 850 each, and you can only have 2 before the cost increases, so you're not going to be able to fill your line with them. But again, if you went for a quality over quantity approach, this is the sort of unit which is going to be able to easily beat units of a similar price bracket from other factions. It's going to take a very high tier unit indeed to go one-to-one with them. But of course, when you're facing off against the elves, you rarely want to be getting into a situation where you're going one-to-one with them. You want to be overwhelming them, and that is of course where the elves can fall down. They don't have any less men in the unit, however, when you compare them to the Eldar Makar, which is interesting. In terms of their abilities, excellent morale and very good stamina. There's nothing too special about them, but even so. I really like the Imladris Guardians, just like with most of the other high-tier Imladris stuff. Their style is on point, and they definitely have a point to them as well, because if you went for... I mean, it's possible you could go for an Imladris Rush, and a unit like this in that sort of situation could be invaluable. Another iconic unit now, the Eldarenwe Heru Masil, obviously previously known as the Eldarenwe Swordsman. Don't be fooled by the fact that I've got 2 on the field, because from here on out this is where we are into the territory of only 1 unit being allowed before the cost increases. And the Eldarenwe Heru Masil are probably one of the most expensive units in the game that you can get which don't have multiple HP, because they are only a single HP. And they don't have anything in terms of really special abilities. They have excellent morale, powerful charge, very good stamina. But a few things worth mentioning. They have a morale of 20, which means they're very, very unlikely to get broken in a battle. And also the fact that their stats are obviously very, very high. An attack of 22 is very, very impressive. A charge bonus of 10 is decent as well. But a total defense of 29, considering the fact that they don't have a shield and they are shock infantry, is also very, very impressive. An armor of 13, going to be very difficult for non-AP units to do a huge amount of damage to them quickly. And a defense skill of 16, of course, will definitely help out there. Very, very difficult to take down, obviously. In terms of an open field fight, cavalry is going to be attracted to them because potential damage you can get off them from a single charge is going to be very, very high. Definitely more of a siege-focused unit, I feel, because if you can get them in a choke point when they're backed up by something which is a little bit more survivable, then you're going to do a tremendous amount of damage to the enemy army. Obviously, they do have an upgrade model as well, but again, I think it's more of the same sort of thing. And why not? The Eldar Enway have always looked fantastic the way they are, that sort of gold effect on their armour, which goes nicely with the silver, which now is throughout Imladris, which I'm glad to see that that style is now more of a universal trait. But yeah, I would say very risky to bring in an open field simply because it's a lot of money to sink into a single unit that is potentially quite fragile. I have seen them used well in an open field, to be fair, so it is a risk that can pay off. But if the enemy has got archers, they're going to be targeting them because the lack of a shield means high tier archers are still going to do a decent amount of damage to them in spite of their high armor values, and cavalry is obviously going to make a beeline for them. If they see a charge, they're going to go for it because of the amount of value they can get in such a short amount of time. But yes, potentially very damaging, but do be careful with them. In a siege, much more easy to use simply because it's unlikely that they're going to be charged very quickly without you being able to react. But very, very powerful in terms of stats, I have to say. 94 men in the unit. You know, it's probably a good thing that you can only bring a single one because, you know, the potential of bringing two for 2200 florins, that would be even more risky. But yeah, definitely one of the glass cannons of the Reforged world. The first unit that we have seen that has multiple HP is the Gwaith Arthand. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong as well. Previously known as the Falas Lords, of course, they are a multiple HP spear unit, so they are going to be very, very resilient. Definitely the sort of thing that could be potentially useful in a siege. Obviously, high tier infantry like this is more of a risk to bring on the field because cavalry charges are going to be your worst nightmare, even for a unit that is good against cavalry like this. Interestingly enough, they can form Skiltron, which is an interesting note. They don't have shield wall, which could potentially be a bit of a problem in terms of trying to push your way through the enemy. But a unit like this, chances are you're not going to be throwing them in to push their way through enemies anyway, because they will be taking quite a lot of damage by doing that. Having a look at some of their stats, so 11 is not a huge amount of attack, but then you don't really expect spears to have a huge attack anyway. But again, the real selling point for the Gwaith is going to be their total defense of 38, which again is the highest that we've seen so far in the Elves of Imladris. The armor value of 14 is very high, the shield value of 11 is high, the defense skill of 13 is pretty high for spears as well, and then add on top of that the multiple HP, they're going to be very, very difficult to break down. Obviously, as with most high tier infantry, you're going to need to back them up to really get the most out of them, but even so, definitely going to be a very, very difficult unit to get past indeed. And again, they have the bonus versus cavalry. Expert at hiding in woods, again, is another interesting one, so Imladris have potentially got that ambush factor going for them, and they of course inspire nearby troops as well, as most high tier, very expensive units like this will do. 1100 is not bad for a unit with multiple HP though. It's probably, in terms of a multiple HP unit, it is the cheapest one we've seen so far, I believe, which, you know, cheap and Imladris is not two words you'll find in the same sentence together very often. Another complicated elven name though, my favourite. And the final Imladris infantry unit we will take a look at is also their most expensive at 1300 florins, the Gwaith Myrdain. Obviously, interestingly enough, they can form Skiltron as well, which is, I think, completely unique with regards to a sword and board unit, or hammer and board unit as it were. Only 54 men in the unit, similar story, obviously you're going to need to support them, otherwise they will be overwhelmed in spite of their extremely high stats. Base attack of 14, which you might think is not the highest, but there is a very good reason for that, and that is of course that they have retained their effectiveness against armour with their warhammers. It's rare, as I've said before, when we were going through the Mithril Guard, that a sort of weapon and board unit is anti-armour in the current patch, and the fact that they are means that they have a tremendous amount of killing power against the correct targets, And of course, as with most of the units that we've seen so far from the High Elves, the Gwyth Myrdain will also have a very high total defense of 38, equal with their spear counterparts, although I believe actually that the defense skill is 1 higher and the armor is 1 less, so that's quite interesting. But having said that, they will be quite resilient against arrows. There aren't very many of them, however, so again, you really want to be keeping them out of arrow fire. But even so, they will be able to withstand a little bit of punishment from range. 1300 is a lot, of course, the most expensive single Imladris foot-based unit, but obviously they are quite potent. And on an open field, I might be tempted to bring them just to put them in the centre of my line, because they can go unnoticed. They are a small unit, and by the time your opponent notices them, the centre of their line could have been eaten away at by the AP damage that they deliver. In a siege, obviously, it's going to be very tempting to bring them over their spear-based cousins. But it really depends who you're up against. I mean, if you're up against a faction which doesn't really traffic in a lot of armour, then you might want to give them Myrdain a miss and go for the spear-based unit instead. But even so, the Smiths of Eregion have always been a very, very powerful infantry unit, and that has not changed. In terms of armour values, we're back down to earth with a bump with the Eldar Quinga, previously known as the Bow Quindi. But, however, when it comes to a skirmish fight, the Elves don't tend to rely on such attrition-based tactics such as armour and shields, but instead, as I mentioned previously, their skill and accuracy. And the Eldar Quinga are very accurate, of course, as they are Elves, but they are a lighter archer, so they can potentially be worn down by many opponents. If you have a look over here as well, I believe you can have 3 Eldar Quinga before the cost increases, and as you can see here, it's going to be the same story with regards to the upgraded unit model, which looks fantastic. I'm a really big fan of that model, to be honest. But having a look at some of the stats, the missile attack is 6, which is, for the cost, it's not bad. I mean, it's not ridiculous like you might expect the Elves to be, but it is really the accuracy which is going to be the primary thing. They can use sharpened stakes, which again is going to be very important, because the Elves really can't afford a decent cav charge to connect with their army, because it's going to do a lot more percentage damage than it would for a Kingdoms of Men, or especially the Orcs, of course. Even the Dwarves can take it on the chin better than the Elves. Definitely a bit of glass-jaw syndrome going on with the Elves in general. Obviously, in terms of melee, a little bit lackluster. If you have a look at their melee attack of 6, it's not dreadful, but you might expect the Elves actually to be slightly better. But as I've said before, the stats might not look too impressive when you compare them to something else, like even the Orc Hunters of Khazad-dûm, you know, have better stats across the board than the Eldar Quinga for not an awful lot more cost. But the key thing here is the accuracy, which is not a stat which is given a numerical value. The fact that the Eldar Quinga are able to much more efficiently use their ammunition, which is a very big factor. And of course, the fact that they are the cheapest skirmisher means if you want to invest more in your infantry and cavalry, which Imladris are much more likely to do, they are probably the least archer focused of the Elven factions. The Eldar Quinga will probably be making quite a few appearances if you're facing against Imladris, or if you want to take Imladris as your primary faction, then I think you're going to be getting to use these guys quite a lot, because for their cost, despite the fact that their stats might look a little bit lackluster compared to some of the others, they will perform very, very well. And they look fantastic. One of the very few units to have remained unchanged in terms of style and name ever since vanilla are the Norteno Warriors. And in terms of archer prowess, they are slightly better than the Eldar Quinga that we met previously, but it is going to be a very similar story. With regards to their armour, they still aren't fantastic with 5 and 0, so they're still going to be quite fragile when they are placed under archer fire, but the primary reason to bring them, of course, is the fact that they are going to be significantly more skillful than the enemies you put them against. They are better in melee as well, with a defensive skill of 10 and a melee attack of 10. They are going to be much more able to stand up for themselves in melee. They will make for, in the late game, a pretty decent makeshift light infantry unit. They can also use sharpened stakes, again, going to be very important. Wait a minute, what was that? Yes, having a look at the, well, it says long-ranged missiles, but yeah, like most of the Elves are going to be able to have decent range on their archers. For the most part, unless the enemy have invested pretty heavily in their skirmish line, you're going to be able to get the first shots off, which is always nice. And they have a slightly higher missile attack of 7, so all in all, they are a slightly more expensive but slightly better version of the Eldar Quinga. It really depends on what you want. Really, I would say the primary thing is that they are slightly better in melee, to be honest with you, because the Eldar Quinga will still do the job at range. But if you feel as though you might need a little bit of extra punch in the late game, then the Norteno Warriors might not be a bad choice, provided you can afford it, of course, because as Imladris, money is always going to be a little bit tight with regards to your army composition. And it says actually that they have an upgraded unit model, but again I think this is another one that doesn't actually change all that much, or if it does, it's very, very limited in terms of the change that is provided in a similar way to the Dwarven Miners, but they look pretty nice anyway. They aren't Rangers, despite the fact that they might look like Elven Rangers. Rangers work a little bit differently, but we'll get onto that at a later date, I'm sure. And to complete the triumvirate of iconic Eldar units, we have the Eldar Heru Quinga. Now obviously in the previous patch this wasn't a unit that I was particularly enamoured with because of their armour-piercing archers laying waste to everything in siege battles, but they have been made more reasonable now. They have of course lost their armour-piercing projectiles. However, they are still a very, very potent skirmish force indeed. They can use sharpened stakes, which again, going to be very nice for the utility they offer. You can only have one before the cost increases, however, and they do cost 1100, so it's a similar story here as it is with the Eldar Swordsmen, and that is that potentially quite risky because they aren't multiple HP, and it is a lot of money to shell out on a unit that is not multiple HP. But then you have a look at their stats and you get a little bit more excited about them. Only 94 men in the unit, but they have they obviously will do quite well for themselves in melee. They have a melee attack of 15, a total defense of 30, with 13 of that being armor, 17 of it being defensive skill, seeing as they don't have any shields, which means they can act pretty much like a mini version of the Eldar Swordsmen in melee, like they always have done. That hasn't changed now. But really the primary thing you're going to want to use them for is of course their arrows. They have a missile attack of 8, so that's only one more than the Norteno Warriors, but in practice they are a very, very effective skirmish unit. They are really, I think, going to be primarily reserved for sieges, however, because bringing them in an open field can be quite risky, because despite the fact they do have good armor values, again, they don't have a shield, they don't have multiple HP, which means they can be focused down by arrows from multiple sources, and if you do bring the Heru Quinga, chances are you've probably skimped out on your archer line in other places, simply because they are, as a single entity, they cost so much. Like, they are nearly the equivalent to 2 units of Eldar Quinga, but even so, I feel as though maybe a little bit of glass cannon syndrome, but having seen them in action, they are very, very impressive, provided they aren't focused down. Again, it's all about that risk-reward thing. If your opponent isn't expecting you to go full archers, then the Heru Quinga can get a great deal of kills. If, however, he's prepared for archers, it's the kind of unit which isn't going to pay any dividends for you. Again, they do apparently have an upgraded unit model, but again, it is largely the same sort of thing. So yeah, I'm not going to be laying down the hate on them anymore. They aren't going to be the source of my ire, because they are finally, I think, exactly what an elven archer should be, based around their skill rather than being used as a bludgeoning tool to just lay waste to entire armies all on their lonesome. And to round off the Imladris skirmish line, we have the Uber tier unit that they bring to the table, the Godhelm Ainiawa. I've butchered that. But regardless, they're the Noldor Elder Nobles, you all know what they're called. But having a look at some of their stats, and obviously if we have a look over here, you can see that they also have an upgrade model in a similar vein to the Imladris Sentinels. They will be able to be upgraded in such a way. Having a look, however, at their stats, which is what we really want to have a look at, the soldiers, there are only 54 men in the unit, as you would expect from an Uber tier unit. They inspire nearby troops. The fact that they can hide anywhere is pretty important, because I feel as though a unit like this is going to be focused down if the enemy sees them. However, the fact that they can hide means you can leave them for the late game. And in the late game, provided you haven't suffered too heavily, if things are looking relatively even, this is exactly the sort of unit which can turn the battle in your favour. They are not armour-piercing missiles, however, so you can't expect them to lay waste to armoured units in the same way that something like the Dalian Dragon Slayers will. They can frighten nearby enemy infantry, however, and obviously they are very, very accomplished melee fighters as well, as the Noldor Elder Nobles have always been. They've always been that hybrid unit. Having a look at their melee attack, 17 is a huge amount of melee attack for a unit like this. They also have a total defense of 30. 8 armour is not as big as we've seen from Imladris previously. It is good for the Elves, however. Having a look at their shield value as well, the fact they have a shield value means that they are going to be a little bit more resilient to arrows again. In the late game, when your opponent is running low on their arrow supply, this could come into play pretty heavily, and a defense skill of 15, of course, just adding to their melee prowess. Missile attack of 8, so in terms of damage, they're going to be pretty on level terms with the Eldarenway archers, but even so, I think the extra 100 might well be worth it. Certainly in a siege you're going to be seeing them all the time because the potential damage they can do from the early game with their missiles and then being used as melee infantry in the late game is going to be very, very strong, I feel like. But even on an open field, I mean, of all of the units we've seen so far, of all of the Uber tier units, it's probably the one most likely to show up in an open field. Not overall, of course, we'll get onto the one that is a little bit later on, but I don't know, that ability to hide everywhere is important. If you can conserve your army, leave stuff in reserve with the ability to hide, particularly with something which is as high value as this, which the enemy would otherwise be focusing down. It's a good point to their a good feather in their cap, I should say. But yes, definitely a very lethal archer unit, as they have always been. Now though, we shall move on to another real strength of Imladris, and that is their cavalry. Starting off with another unit which has remained unchanged in terms of unit model and name since vanilla, is the equivalent to the Norteno archers, the Norteno Cavalry. They are the lightest of the High Elven cavalry, and this comes with its own risks, of course, because they are the most fragile in terms of their armour values. 6 is not bad, but it's certainly not anything to write home about either. The lack of a shield is going to do them in as well, so they can be zoned out by archers as well as the standard fare of crossbows, spears and pikes. Having said that, the charge bonus of 10, as basic lancers, they have one purpose, and that is of course to get nice charges off on enemy infantry. You can only have 2 before the cost increases. Having a look again, going over here, the unit model doesn't really change when you upgrade the armour all that much. But yeah, I mean, there isn't really much to say about this unit. It says effective against armour. I think that's off the charge rather than in sustained melee. I could be wrong about that, but I think that all lancers have the effective against armour trait off the charge because it really helps them do their damage, otherwise armoured units would be able to resist it. But in sustained melee I'm pretty sure they're not. And obviously as lancers, they are going to be vulnerable in sustained melee, so if you're going for a more cavalry heavy build, I would say it's definitely worth bringing them, simply because obviously it adds a lot more numbers. 64 men in the unit, 675 as well is pretty cheap for Imladris. You know, it's definitely, when you're talking in the 600s, that is the most bargain basement prices you can expect from this faction. But definitely be careful with them because they will not win in a cavalry fight with heavy knights or heavy melee cavalry from other factions. They will do okay against enemy lancers, but that's about it. So you do want to be careful with them, potentially lethal off the charge. I do like them, but you do need to be careful with them. You know, micro is going to be very important with lancers, and if you mess it up, you'll see these guys die off pretty quickly, especially seeing as they don't have a shield and can be targeted by archers. And now we move into some of the more expensive Imladris cavalry, because the Imladris Sentinels, which are the next cavalry on up, are 1,000, which is a significant jump in price. Having said that, they do have a few more things which make them pretty dangerous to enemies. Obviously, they still have the ability to do a lot of damage off the charge with the armour piercing. They also inspire nearby troops, which is an interesting one because for the most part lancers like this are going to be on the move and away from your infantry line. Very situational, that bonus, but it's nice to have it regardless. Now as lancers, of course, this does mean they have the malus in melee against other cavalry, so again it's going to be the sort of cavalry you want to be quite careful with. The primary difference here though is in the defensive values. Their defense skill is higher, but in particular their armour is higher. The armour of 10 is a value of 4 higher, and this means that they are going to be much more resilient to enemy horse skirmishers than the Norteno Cavalry. Norteno Cavalry can suffer a little bit, particularly if you're up against a horse skirmisher heavy faction like Rohan or Khand. Imladris Sentinels much more resilient to that sort of thing. They can safely ignore horse archers almost and just go for the soft targets in the line. Whether they're worth this amount more than the Norteno Cavalry is debatable, but they do certainly pack a punch, and despite the fact their stats might not look too much more impressive than the Norteno Cavalry, they are a significant amount more resilient to the things that the Norteno Cavalry will have to avoid, the horse skirmishers and the foot skirmishers. They're also very, very quick, as most High Elven cavalry is. It's very swift. Not the sort of thing you want to get entangled in enemy cavalry. You want to be moving around. You want to be outpacing your opponent and charging their infantry and doing a lot of damage there. Because Imladris' lancers are very, very powerful. You don't have any melee cavalry of your own, but if you go lance to lance with another cavalry unit, you're probably going to come out on top. And the Imladris Sentinels, they're pricey, but if you use them correctly, they're definitely worth it. And now we make a return to the Eldar Enway with the Eldar Enway Heru Mairu, and Unlike the Imladris cavalry before us and the Norteno cavalry, you can only have one before the cost increases rather than two. However, there is a pretty decent jump in terms of stats between these guys and the Imladris cavalry, and it's worth mentioning that they are very, very effective as a single unit. Now, obviously, they are still lancers. They still have the effectiveness against armor on the charge. They can form wedge as well. Wedge is an interesting one. I've always in a similar way to shooting circle, wedge has always been a bit of a strange one to me because, for the most part, people are going to defend their front relatively well. So just trying to sort of force your way through the enemy formation with wedge is going to be a little bit more. It's going to be highly situational. I've never used wedge and had it be useful in 3rd Age, put it that way. But having a look, they have an attack of 8, obviously a charge bonus of 20, which is enormous. It's double the amount that the Norteno cavalry have. And having a look at their defence, this defence is really where they stand out because they have a total defence of 35. Armour of 12 is very high, 2 in excess of the Imladris cavalry. Skill of 14, but it's the shields that really adds to them. The 9 shield value means... All of this means that horse archers and foot-based skirmishers are not going to do a lot of damage to the Eldar Enway Heru-Mairu. It's going to be down to enemy cavalry and enemy crossbows in order to really deal with them, or enemy javelins. But if you keep them moving, then it's going to be very difficult for the enemy to do that. Obviously, your best bet is going to be to ignore the enemy cavalry as best you can, because they are still going to be fast, as High Elven cavalry is, and really start charging the enemy infantry and whittling down their lines, because you do need to equalise the numbers somehow. And honestly, on an open field, Imladris' lancers are probably your best means of doing that. And obviously they look fantastic, as all the Eldar Enway do. And that brings us on to the final Lancer cavalry that the Elves of Imladris have available to them. We have the almighty Gwaith y Rochdor, at least I think that's how it's pronounced. I don't think it's Rochdor anyway. Having a look at some of the abilities they have, obviously they inspire nearby troops, as a lot of General's bodyguard units tend to. Again, they are Lancers, I believe. I don't think they qualify as Knights. I think they are just Lancers. Which means they are effective against armour off the charge, of course. Having a look at some of their stats, an attack of 6 is actually not that high, interestingly enough, which I think that kind of confirms that they aren't knights, to be honest. Having a look at the charge bonus is 15, so it is actually less than the Eldar Enway, and their total defence is less as well at 30. Having a look at the armour, it's 12, the shield is equivalent at 9, their defensive skill, however, is significantly less. But of course, as with most sort of very high Uber tier units, the fact that they have multiple HP is going to be key here, because in the last patch, multiple HP cavalry was king of the battlefield, and even though it has been toned down a lot in this current patch, they can still be used to devastating effect. And obviously when you have swift high elven cavalry like this that has multiple HP, it's going to be very difficult to cut them down to size. A quick crossbow volley will do it, a quick javelin volley will do it, but most high elven players who know what they're doing are going to be keeping this cavalry out of sight of such things, going to be using them at the opportune moment. But again, their stats are, well, other than the hit points, are actually less than the Eldar Enway, so it really depends on what you want to bring. It's going to be interesting to see, I think, how the meta goes with regards to the Imladris cavalry. But I do think that the multiple HP gives you more margin for error. So if you're feeling a little bit less confident in your micro, I think the Gwaith is certainly going to be the better choice. But if you're feeling up to it, you could try and micro your Eldar Enway, and they could offer you pretty similar results. But I mean, they look fantastic. I really like the fact that their helms have been given the same treatment as the other Eldar Enway units. It looks really nice. So yeah, that rounds out the High Elven Lancers, but we still have one High Elven Cavalry unit remaining. The emphasis on movement for the High Elven Cavalry has already been established, so it naturally follows that they have Horse Archers, and again, this is something that they always have. Horse Archers have always been a bit undercooked, though, in previous versions of the game. Even in Standard 3rd Age, they were never really worth bringing unless it was the Grey Company. Now, however, Horse Archers certainly have a place on the battlefield, and the Imladris Riders are no exception. Of course, that famous Elven archery is going to be broadcast in all its glory when you use them, because they are going to be very accurate. Obviously, against high armoured targets, they're still not going to do a huge amount of damage, but it's really kiting that they're going to be used for primarily. And if you use them in conjunction with your Lancers, you can level the playing field against units which would otherwise beat you in sustained melee, which is interesting. But generally speaking, you don't want to be engaging too much in such attrition-y based tactics. Having a look at some of their stats though, I mean, honestly, they're not terrible in melee, having a melee attack of 7 and a total defense of 18 with an armor of 8, that's not half bad. The charge bonus, however, for Horse Archers is very poor, it's only 1. So you know, you can use them as sort of utility cavalry in the late game when they've exhausted their ammunition supply, but don't expect them to run down troops in the same way that dedicated lancer or even melee cavalry is capable of doing. You know, horse archers are certainly not going to be as useful in that capacity anyway. But a missile attack of 8, that's on par in terms of damage with all of their foot-based archers. The price they pay for this, of course, is that they are a little bit more exposed. Enemy foot archers are going to be targeting them, and they will do a significant amount of damage. There are only 53 in the unit as well, so you do leave yourself a little bit open to that. It depends really on what matchup you're in, whether I think the Imladris riders are worth it or not. I don't think you should engage in terms of a horse-to-horse shooting competition with the likes of Rohan or Khan, for example. And if you suspect the enemy is going to go foot archer heavy, they're certainly not going to be cost efficient either. But if you think that the enemy is going to go for a much more aggressive attack, is going to try and rush you down with only a few cavalry units protecting their back lines, the Imladris riders can certainly be the sort of things which cause a lot of damage over the course of the battle, which really helps swing it in your favour. I like them. I think they're a very good horse archer unit, considering that the horse archers are now very useful. It is risky to bring them in certain matchups though, so do be careful. And here we have the Ballista, and it says High Elven Ballista, and I'm fairly certain that there are some differences between the High Elven Ballista and the normal one. I think it's to do with the accuracy, but overall the Ballista is still going to be used for the same sort of things as it always was, and also it's not horribly out of place like the Dwarven Ballista is. I think actually a hotfix is going to be coming to fix the Khazad-dûm and Erebor Ballista pretty shortly. But yes, obviously there's not really much that needs to be said about the Ballista. It is what it is. It can snipe out enemy artillery. It can also deal a decent amount of damage at long range, and it can force your opponent to come to you if you are deploying a little bit further back on the field. So yeah, a potentially useful tool, but nothing too special. It is what it is. In a similar vein to the Ballista, we have the High Elven Catapult. It's pretty much exactly the same story here. I would question on an open field whether or not the High Elves have got the capacity to defend it, because obviously you're going to need to form a defensive perimeter around it to prevent enemy cavalry from simply going in and killing it. And I don't know, I mean, it is an interesting gambit, but most of the time the enemy is going to come to you anyway as the Elves, and the catapult is mainly a tool in an open field to force the enemy to come forwards, and after that its usefulness is really spent. And 1,000 on that, considering the enemy is probably going to be trying to charge you down as quickly as possible anyway, is a questionable decision. But it could potentially work. Some people might want to try and out-skirmish the Elves in terms of numbers, and if you have a catapult that might prove to be a little bit more difficult. So yeah, interesting. Obviously in a siege it can potentially be very useful, offensive or defensive. But yeah, so that is the High Elven roster in all its glory. So the ultimate question, what do I think of Imladris? Well, I like them a great deal simply because they kind of go against the grain with regards to the Elves, in that you're encouraged to be a little bit more proactive with them. I do appreciate that in the later part of the patch they did change the Elves to be a little bit less just stand still and shoot everything and kill it. And Imladris have never really been about that though, because the infantry focus that Imladris have with their Lancer cavalry, it encourages you to build an elite corps to really stand your ground with, and then use your Lancers and your Archers and your high damage units to really inflict some heavy pain on the enemy as they engage you. You can be more aggressive with Imladris as well. The addition of the decent armour values certainly helps their cause quite a lot. And yeah, I will say that they are quite risky in certain ways though. You do want to be careful when you play as Imladris, simply because the temptation might be to purchase all of their really expensive units, but then your army is going to be too small. Individually, your army may well be very powerful, at least unit to unit, but there is something to be said for having just an army of fodder units which can just overwhelm and envelop you, and as the Elves you really want to be avoiding that. That's why I feel like going wide as the Elves is honestly a pretty good thing to do, because unlike the Dwarves have got some pretty decent numbers that they can use to make a noob box like that work, but I don't think a noob box is going to work against the Elves the vast majority of the time. If the enemy invests in their infantry properly, eventually you're going to be overwhelmed. So I think that you need to be bold. as Imladris, I think is the key, and I think that's why I respect playing as Imladris. I don't mind losing to Imladris either, because most of the time it's because I've been outclassed in melee rather than being kited around the map and shot to death, which can happen if you're playing against the Elves and you've built your army wrong. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed and found this a little bit informative. So yeah, as we all know, men are weak, so it's time for you to take action as Imladris.